we need to sort of change the narration. And thanks to people like you that are taking time to really look at the story. Because even when we say writing that African people are not documenting their history, it is even very delicate as a case because we need to look at it very well. One can just go there and regurgitate, like many African historians do, go there and regurgitate what the European people have written about Africa. And because you are an African telling the story, it makes it sort of legitimate. But it is that you are doing more harm than good in that you, as an African, you really need to go down and dig the story up because the story is about you. You don't have any reason to be regurgitating what the Europeans have written in terms of African history, in terms of world history even, because history is nothing more than just his whole version of the story. It's called his story, his whole story. So that is what it should be. So I think we should be bold enough to write history according to how we understand it, according to how it makes sense to us, not according to what there is nothing like general history. There is nothing like history without sentiment. That is why I think Ben was saying that white people cannot teach Black history. It doesn't make sense because there are a lot of people that are involved in that.
Right. And you know, you had great historians like Sheikh Enti Diop, like Dr. Ben, like Ivan Van Sertima, like Ranoku Rashidi, like Kaba Kabane. These are a lot of great brothers that have been speaking this truth for a long time. But they've been labeled as Afrocentrics and they've been debunked by Eurocentric scholarship. And there's been vast proof. I mean, you're talking about Ivan Van Sertima's discussion on Africans and the discovery of America. There's lots of evidence of African people already being in America before Columbus. But the denial continues. The denial continues because the fear of an uprising of Africans knowing who they truly were. Sheikh Enti Diop, he spoke on these issues about Egypt, on how Egyptians described themselves as no different than the Ethiopian people in the tomb of Ramses the second, I believe. And he also challenged the Egyptian antiquities and mentioned how the melanin levels were no different in ancient Egyptian mummies that he had tested. I believe he tested over 150 common people mummies in Egypt and found that they are just no different than any other sub-Saharan African that they have labeled. So there have been many brothers that have fought this fight. It's just that Eurocentric scholarship will continue to try to debunk them for the simple fact that they fear the knowledge and the understanding of true African history going around the world. But that's inevitable. It's going to happen anyway.
It's going to happen anyway. I like that. I like that courage. Because I think this is the time for us to really take up the story. It doesn't even make sense that Egypt is white. It doesn't make any sense. If they are white, then where did they came from? They came from Europe. Egypt, have written said the European history didn't even develop yet.
Exactly.
So are they coming from Asia? Are they Chinese? But why would they come from China to develop Africa? Because at the time, if you take it on the timeline, just looking at the achievement in Egypt, pair it up with Asia, it is not that is the time is different.
In fact, there are more pyramids in Sudan, which was the ancient Kush. And there's more pyramids there. There are more other pyramids throughout the African continent that aren't discussed. I mean, we can talk about the people of Benin. We could talk about a lot of other pyramids that have been discovered that have no connection to Europe whatsoever or Asia. So we know that the pyramid building started in Africa, and it even started below Egypt, which many would call ancient Kush or ancient Ethiopia. So that's extensive proof right there that pyramid building was exclusively an African thing.
And also the idea, the philosophy behind even the structure itself or the pyramid is something that needs to be explained. Because now you go to Washington, you see that because this European Western historian, they think they are very intelligent by going around saying that Africa have no history. Because in the past, a lot of historians of Western historians have written a lot to show that Africa have no history. But in that case, somebody can make a very simple and ask a very simple question. How come that in the Vatican City, Rome, we have obelisks. Obelisk is not
Mhm.
it's not a European invention. What is the pyramid structure doing in Paris?
And
What
we
is
and
what
we
is it doing?
also the priest also wears the white crown of Horus. you know, so you have the obelisk that's here in America of Tutmosis the Third. So obviously these the American civilization, even if you turn around the dollar bill, you see a pyramid there, the U.S. dollar. So they have always given reference to Egypt. In fact, Rome, Greece, all these civilizations that came before America, they always gave reference to Egypt. Think about if you really take a think about Egypt, right? Egypt, the Babylonians came into Egypt, the Assyrians came into Egypt, the Greeks came into Egypt, the Romans came into Egypt. Everyone came into Egypt to learn and study. You have a man named Herodotus who talks about the antiquities of Egypt being the oldest of all men, as well as the Ethiopians being considered the oldest of all men. And what does that term Ethiopian mean? That term just means of the burnt face, of the black face. So this is who they knew African people to be at that time, and they claimed they were the most beautiful of all people and the most knowledgeable of all people, according to antiquities, based off guys like Herodotus, Aristotle, all these Greek philosophers, Plato. All of these guys studied guys like Imhotep, who was actually the first mega genius that the world had ever seen, constructing the first pyramid of Djoser. So it's a lot of history to uncover. This is why they had to separate Egypt from Africa, because if you leave Egypt in Africa, then basically you're saying we learned everything from Black people. And that's not what they wanted to do. That was not the narrative Eurocentric scholarship wanted.
If that is the intention that they have failed, because the other day I was still checking, Egypt was still in Africa. They still haven't moved. Not an inch.
Exactly. But they'll tell you, that Europeans were in Africa building pyramids in 133 degrees Fahrenheit. It just doesn't line up geographically, and it also doesn't line up, period. Physically, it can't happen. It wouldn't happen.
Anyway, Emmanuel, now let's let's start from the story itself. The Pharaoh, the Black Pharaoh.
Yeah.
Now, how did the project start? Give us a background of the project itself.
Yeah, when I first came up with the title I, Black Pharaoh, Golden Age of Triumph, people was thinking that the term black means black skin. No. To the Egyptians, the term black meant ascended into the God form or completion. So when you hear the term I, Black Pharaoh, to be clear, the term I, Black Pharaoh simply means I am the Pharaoh of completion, which was Tutmosis the third. I was researching. Originally, I was doing a film. I was working on a film about my great ancestor, Shaka Zulu. If you look at my last name, Kulu and Zulu, we're only one letter off. We're literally of the same tribe and derived of the same tribe. So I initially wanted to do something in South Africa. We ran into some problems because of the Shaka Zulu film of 1986. They didn't allow us to get the copyrights to do a new film. So we kind of just put that project to the wayside. And I started to recall what I went through as a child, and I said, you know what? We couldn't do Shaka Zulu. So let's do Egypt. So I wanted to find someone somewhat like Shaka Zulu in North Africa. And it came down to Ramses the Great, Taharka, and Tutmosis III. Those were the three Egyptian pharaohs that I was looking at as possibly doing a story about. So then I started reading about a great queen, and I was like, what great queen can I talk about? I said, I don't want to talk about Cleopatra. I don't want to talk about Nefertiti because they're always bringing them up. I want to do someone else. So I came across this queen called Hatshepsut, who ruled the world for 20 to 25 years. And it was undoubtedly that these were African when you look at these sculptures of Tutmosis III and Hatshepsut. So I decided these are going to be the two African kings and queens that I'm going to discuss. And it just so happened that they were they reigned right after each other, and they had great connection between each other. So I wanted to tell this story from an African perspective, and that's where it began.
That's very interesting. So when you discover the story, you pin in that okay, this is the story I wanted to tell. How did you go about it? Talking from the point of view of research, because now you need to know the story that you want to tell.
Right. Well, you got to do a lot of traveling. You got to do a lot of research. When it comes to Egyptian antiquities, it's very important that you talk to the people of Aswan, because Aswan is pretty much the Black region of Egypt today. So taking trips there, understanding what was happening in Egypt at that time, also doing research on each individual, seeing their connections to each other. So it takes a lot. It was a lot of research to understand the story, to see what did I want to fit in my story, what didn't I want to fit in the story. I also used some biblical narratives as well to make connections to this Egyptian story, because if you go back and do the research on the biblical narrative, you find there's a lot of contact between ancient Israel and ancient Egypt. So I also tied that in within the story as well for those who are Bible believers, to also make that connection as well. So it took a lot of research. I mean, you're talking 3 years of research plus traveling.